FBA. Recently, there has been controversy regarding FBA and a rapper named Fat Joe. Now, Fat Joe is a rapper of Puerto Rican descent. He was born and raised in the United States in Bronx, New York. Matt Hoffer, who did the interview with Fat Joe, has parents from Barbados. He was also born and raised in the United States. With that being said, what is FBA exactly? And are these two individuals FBA as well? First, FBA means Foundational Black Americans. Where did this come from? Where did this notion come from? Well, it came from a man named Tariq Nasheed. Tariq Nasheed is an American film producer and internet personality. He is best known for his Hidden Colors film series, as well as his commentary and promotion of conspiracy theories on social media, which includes pseudoscience regarding race. He is a proponent of Foundational Black Americans, FBA, which is an ideology and movement that he personally founded, which he defines as any person classified as black who can trace their bloodline lineage back to the American system of slavery. To be designated as an FBA, at least one parent must come from a non-immigrant background in the United States of America. Now, she believes FBAs must seek out reparations. What is FBA exactly? Let's start from the beginning of what it is to be black. First off, to know what it is to be black, we need to understand the definition of race and its origin. Race was invented in the 16th and 17th centuries by Anglo-Saxons in Europe. I'm going to show you a video from PBS that perfectly defines the origin of race. Check it out.
We all have a working definition of race. Whether you kinda understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint hint, cough cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, indenture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies, and many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because 1, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. 2, slaves were not considered human. 3, it was not a contract because it takes 2 consenting humans to enter into a contract. And 4, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place, and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question: how did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was...
If you're thinking about buying plugins this holiday season, wait! In this ultimate
illogical? The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation discrimination laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century.
Now, speaking of Puerto Ricans, right? Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's United States territory. So technically, Puerto Ricans are considered Americans. Let's look at the genetic makeup of an average Puerto Rican. According to the National Geographic Demographic Project, the average Puerto Rican individual carries 12% Native American ancestry, 65% Western Eurasian ancestry, which includes the Mediterranean, North European, and Middle Eastern and North African, and 20% Sub-Saharan African DNA. The average Puerto Rican or Puerto Ricans in general are considered to be what is known as mulatto. A mulatto is a racial classification that refers to people of mixed African and European ancestry. I repeat, African and European ancestry. The history of the name or the word comes from, you guessed it, the Atlantic slave trade. Let's explain why the average Puerto Rican has Native American ancestry at 12% and African ancestry at least 20%. Well, the history of Afro-Puerto Ricans traces its origin to the arrival of free West African black men, Juan Ponce de Leon, at the start of the colonization of the island. Upon landing and settling there, the Spaniards enslaved the Tano natives for the extraction of gold. In addition, many Tano slaves were subject to harsh treatment, and women were subject to sexual abuse. The majority of the conquistadors and farmers who settled on Puerto Rico had arrived without women. Many of them intermarried with the African or Taino women. Their multiracial descendants form the first generations of Puerto Ricans today. So that's how Puerto Ricans have 12% Native American ancestry and 20% African ancestry. With that being said, what really is a mulatto? Let's get to it. Now, the average African American in the United States has around 73% African ancestry and 24% European ancestry, with less than 1% Native American ancestry. So what does that mean? Well, we've already seen that Puerto Ricans have both African, Native American, and European ancestry. So do African Americans, who also have African, European, but they have less than 1% Native American ancestry. That's important here because according to the definition of mulatto, mulatto is anyone who is mixed with African and European ancestry. Technically, therefore, every African American born and raised in the United States is a descendant of a slave or slavery, is a mulatto, according to the definition of mulatto. Why? Because there's no such thing as a 100% African American. There's no such thing as an African American being 100% African. The average African American has 24% European, 73% African. Therefore, all African Americans are technically mulattoes. No matter what the skin tone is, may it be dark brown, brown, light, yellow, even sometimes close to pale. All African Americans, or even individuals who are considered mulatto, are still technically mulatto in the sense of genealogy. Genealogy is important here when we look at what is an FBA. Because if you look at it, the average Puerto Rican has 12% Native American ancestry. Therefore, 12% of their ancestry is indigenous to the Americas, while the average African American has less than 1% ancestry indigenous to the Americas. Therefore, technically, technically, if you look at it, according to the definition of FBA, Puerto Ricans are considered FBA due to the factors of slavery, plus they are descendants of African slaves. In addition, they are 12% native indigenous to the Americas. So therefore, America is their land genetically and ancestrally. Now let's get back to the concept of race. Now, race is actually considered a social construct not based on skin color alone, but social class. The original intent of race was that individuals who were Anglo-Saxon were considered white because they are the inventors of the ideology of race. They created that ideology in the 17th century. Second, all individuals who are non-Anglo-Saxon at the time were classified as black or non-white. It didn't matter what your skin color was as long as you were Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, or from the Germanic tribes, you were considered white. Anyone else outside of that spectrum was considered non-white or black. But things changed due to slavery. As the Americas began to colonize, many of those non-white groups began petitioning to be white, such as Italians, such as Jews, and so forth. Many of these groups petitioned the United States to be classified as white. And who was left to be black? African Americans. Even Armenians at one point were considered black until a court case in the 20th century where an Armenian man petitioned the United States that Armenians, despite their brown skin or tan skin, was actually European and could be classified as white. They won that court case. And now people who like Kim Kardashian, who has tan skin naturally, who in the past, before the court case would be classified as black, now they are classified as white. There's no such thing as white skin. There is no such thing as black skin. All skin tone derives from the melanin pigmentation of brown. You have the dark brown and then you have pale. The whole spectrum of skin color derives from the color brown. There's no such thing as black skin. There's no such thing as white skin. It's either dark brown or pale. Those are the two extremes. In summary, FBA technically applies, if you look at the definition, of all African Americans, no matter where you came from, as long as you are American, born and raised specifically if you are American. But people may say, well, they are not from the United States. Well, let's look at the definition of American. According to the definition of an American, as an adjective relating to or a characteristic of the United States or its inhabitants, relating to or denoting the continents of America, which means North, Central, and South America, including its associated islands. The noun version of American, a native or citizen of the United States, a native or inhabitant of any of the countries of North, South, or Central America. So, according to the definition, anyone from North America, Central America, South America, or the associated islands of the Americas is considered American. So, with that being said, anyone living in America or the Americas born and raised with African ancestry is considered a foundational Black American. That means Math Hoffa is a foundational Black American. That means Fat Joe is a foundational Black American, according to the definition. So, but what really is the purpose of FBA? Well, the purpose of FBA is for one man, Tariq Nasheed. He invented that acronym. He invented that ideology. Therefore, that ideology only benefits him. It does not benefit any other African American. So when we promote FBA, it's not for the benefit of African Americans in general. It only financially benefits Tariq Nasheed, the one who came up with that ideology, people. So who are we exactly? We are just human beings who happen to have various ancestries, whether it be African, European, Asian, Native American, so forth. We need to start acting like real humans and stop the divide that keep us separated. We need to act like humans and stop this division when all of us come from the same cloth, the same genetics, the same ancestry. We all have European ancestry. We all have African ancestry. Europeans have African ancestry, though it's very tiny because the African ancestry can only be traced back to the first Homo sapien migrations out of Africa into Europe. But many of us, the vast majority of the world, especially in the United States, have all three ancestries: African, European, and Native American, which is Asian ancestry.